I'm back. Okay, so before the break we got started with our first unit test. I think we can carry on with that now. So, GamerCoder asks, say you have 1 million users. I'm not sure what you're asking exactly. Do you mean specifically for this implementation? What if you have 1 million users in that array? Is that what you're asking? Could you maybe be a little bit more specific? I'm not sure the 1 million users or the size of that initial array matters all that much when we're talking about how we implement this method. Obviously, we'll need to have great ways of handling the memory load that 1 million users makes, but it's kind of a side point to how we actually implement this. In fact, we're at a good spot to start implementing this, right? So let's just check that everything's working here. Okay, we're at a good place to start implementing this. So just to recap, we're getting this error here, failed asserting that null is true. And that's because if we look at the implementation, we're not doing anything here, right? We're saying that we need to return a Boolean from here in the tests, but we're not. Neither true nor false. So what do we want to do with this? Well, let's have a look back at our test, at the way that we designed this. We have an array of users, and this could be small, this could be huge, but we give this as a constructor argument to array authenticator. So we need to make a constructor here, public function construct. This will accept an array of users, and we'll probably want to store this in like a protected, maybe even a private users array, okay? We can define this as, well, we don't even need to define this because the constructor requires that we have these users provided here, right? So if we don't give that array, this will never get initialized, so this can be null. In this constructor, we'll set this. So we'll say this users is users. Okay. So at this point, we should have these users stored in this array. When authenticate's called, if someone tries to create a new array authenticator object without the users array, they're going to get a big old error. But once they've created that, we can depend on those users being there. We can say something like return array filter this users, and this takes a callback, right? So user as the argument. Now this array filter function is really useful. What we're saying here is filter this initial array of users, and for each user run this function where the user is provided as an argument to that function. Okay, in fact, let's call this filtered because we're not going to return it directly. Let's give ourselves a bit more space. So here we'll say return, we'll also need to extend the scope of this credentials variable. When you have a function in PHP, it doesn't immediately have access to all the variables outside that function. So if we want to use this credentials inside, we have to use this use statement with all the variables in a comma delimited list here that we want to have access to within the function. It's like a pretty weird scoping thing. You're probably not used to it if all you do is JavaScript, or many other languages don't do this, but PHP does this. So inside this filter function, we want to return all users where the credentials match. So we can say something like return if user. Now this is another interesting thing. We're not enforcing the type of user. It could be an array, it could be an object. Do we want to worry about that now? Maybe not. Maybe let's write another test to do that kind of thing. Okay, so we're getting our credentials here. Maybe what we want to say is that we expect these to always be objects. We expect these to always be objects. We expect them to always have specific properties. So we could say something like return if username is credentials username, and if I'll just copy this out here. If user password is credentials password. In fact, maybe the way we want to enforce this is to say that user always needs to be an array, because then the syntax looks very similar. User could contain other things in here, right? The user that we assign in this array could have a whole bunch of other fields, but we're only interested in the username and the password for each user to work out what this filter does. We can maybe make this, nah, I think it's fine for now. I'll just say and there. Well, maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll put it all in one line. Why not? Put it all in one line. Okay. Now, what determines if this is a successful match or not? Am I still muted? I hope not. No. Chat's very quiet. Why are you guys so quiet? Okay. So what determines if this is a match or not, a successful match or not? Well, what we do want to do is allow a single user matching the credentials through. We don't want to allow multiple users, and we don't want to allow people whose credentials don't match. So what we can say is return if count filtered is exactly 1. If it's not, we'll return false. That may mean multiple users, that may mean no users are matched. But if just one user is returned, then we return true. Okay, let's see if this works. Let's go back here, vendor bin PHP unit. That passes both the assertions. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's commit this. Added test and implementation for authenticator. Authenticate. Really cool. Okay, let's design on this a little bit more. Does that gamer coder, does that give you an idea of, does that maybe make it a little clearer how the implementation that we do might not matter whether it is a large user set or a small user set, as long as we manage that memory, right? Does that make sense? There are ways, for instance, that we could make this not work with an array. We could make it work with a generator or an iterator that lazy loads stuff. We could do that. We wouldn't be able to use array filter. We'd have to use something else. But it's possible, right? We don't have to have all these users in memory at once. We'd have to iterate over them all, surely, but we don't have to load them all in memory at once. Does that make sense? Sweet. Okay, let's design this a little bit more. We have these users as an array of stuff, but that's not necessarily how they need to be, right? Maybe what we want to say is that if someone gives us users where they aren't arrays, we throw an error. So let's design this a little bit. Public function test input users are array. Now, the test that we want to do is if we have an invalid user format. So we only need one of these, but we can say something like user is new new standard class user username. We can do this as well. Okay, so this seems okay, right? We can get the username and the password properties here, but actually it's an invalid format. So we don't need this array anymore. But what we can say is something like, okay, this expect exception. And for expect exception, I think it's expect exception or even maybe set expected exception. Set expected exception, I think that's the function name. Now what this takes is a class name for the kind of exception that we expect to throw. And from PHP 5.5 onward, we have a magic class constant. So we can say something like use invalid argument exception. And we can say that the expected exception is this class. It'll convert this to a string so that set expected exception is valid. But now what we'll say is new, let's do this. Something like this, where we still have an initial array, so the type check passes, but user, because it's an object, is not a valid subtype, so this throws an exception. Let's run this and see what happens. vendor PHP unit. Okay. So, okay, firstly, we don't have this class in here. We probably have to import this. So use that, and I'll just use the... It's a good thing PHP class names are case insensitive. Anyway, let's run this. Okay, so now we have a failure. Failed asserting that a exception of invalid argument exception is thrown. Now think about why this is. We've got a test to check that this exception throws because this is the wrong type. But when we go back to our implementation, we're just setting it internally. Authenticate will fail because this user is not an array. So it'll say something like accessing array property on non-array. That'll be a kind of exception that it'll throw. But maybe we can do something like array map, array each. Well, we can do a for each. Maybe array, I don't know. Let's just do a for each loop. For each users as user. If not is array user invalid argument exception. Okay, throw a new exception if the user is not an array. Again, we'll have to import this because we're not in the global namespace. So maybe we can expect it now. Yes, that works. Okay. So again, we added a test in here for the kind of API that we wanted. Then we went into our one implementation of it and wrote that functionality to get the test to pass. Now, let me take a step back here and even go into talkie-talkie mode. A lot of people, when they're demonstrating TDD, go for very, very small steps. So they say something like, make a test class, make a test, see that it fails. Inside that test, but inside that test, create a new instance of a class that doesn't exist. See that it fails because the class doesn't exist. Then go make the class. Then see that it fails because the method you're calling on that class doesn't exist. Then go make the method. What I've done here is I've cut out quite a few of these steps. I'm still making the test first. I'm still using the test to determine what the functionality of that class should be like before I write any of that functionality. But for steps I know are immediately going to fail, things like class doesn't exist, file doesn't exist, not auto-loaded, method doesn't exist, I don't really want to write those because I know exactly how those are going to fail. It's kind of a waste of time to go through each and every little step there. So I'll make a bare skeleton class for what I'm about to design, like a bare skeleton method in a class that exists, in a file that exists, that is auto-loadable. Then I'll make the test so that I will run that stuff and I won't get any of these method doesn't exist exceptions. And then I will start changing the test so that the test does more and more interesting things. Like here we authenticated, and then we checked that the input types are valid. I'll make those tests first, and then when I see that those fail, because it's not matching my public API, I'll go and I'll change my implementation to start making those tests pass. It's still kind of test before code. It's just skipping out a few of the very small steps that I absolutely know are going to fail every time. Does that make sense? Back to coding. Any questions so far? Ask away. Just ask in chat. It's fine. Now, I think this is kind of ugly. I already have a test that I know is passing, right? But I'd like this to be a little bit more succinct. PHP doesn't have a method for array each because that's very much like what a for each is. But I can't help but want this to be a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit cleaner. That's a good question, GamerCoder. It's difficult to give an answer for every project without knowing the project. Small projects are kind of difficult with this because often you want to do a rapid prototype of something. You have an idea, you want to get something done quickly. So, in those instances, sometimes it works better to write the implementation code just to get your prototype working, just to get it functional, clickable, does a thing, sends an email, writes to the database, right? You do something really rough. And once you know that the prototype is worth building a proper implementation of, you move that out to a different folder, and then you start making your tests. You make your tests for the interface that is the ideal interface for towards a prototype that you know you can build. Okay, so it's kind of a mix of the two. Now, that takes a lot of time, and it doesn't work for everyone. But I definitely think doing test-driven development for medium to large projects, and if you have the time for small projects as well, doing test-driven development is a really good thing to do. Not only because you have tests that make sure that your code isn't broken, but because it helps you design thinking from the perspective of someone who is going to use your implementation, not just you ticking away at your prototype. I do have the voice and attitude of someone who does this as a job, because I do this as a job, Angerblade. I'm a developer for a company that does a lot of open source, and I work in an open source team, and so I write a lot of open source every day. And PHP is the language that I do, done for a long time. So at least I sound assertive, I guess. Any other questions? Now I'll tell you a little secret. Instead of doing this stuff and expecting an invalid argument exception, we could have just said something like array user, and that would have validated when array filter is run. That would get to a non-array object and say function expects array is called with an object. The trouble is that this is very clear what's going on. It would be even clearer if we had a message saying user must be an array. But if the error is down here and someone looks at it, it might not be immediately apparent what the problem is. If we have this exception here, and we have a message here saying this should be one type, but it's not, then it's very clear when something goes wrong, what's gone wrong. But if we just have this kind of array type hinting here, well, someone may look at this and say, am I using this wrong? Essentially they are, but it's not immediately clear how they're using it wrong. It's just that by the time it gets here, it's in a wrong state. So I don't want to do this array type hinting here. I mean, I could, but it's unnecessary now because I'm checking for arrays here. Okay, so we're validating for authenticate, and we've implemented that. We're validating for this type checking, and we've implemented that. What do we still want to do to this class? Is this a useful thing now? Maybe. I just want to rename this quickly. So test inputs validated. Maybe what we can do is extend this API to allow the return of the thing that validates correctly. Maybe we can do that. We don't have any way to get the original list of data out. So if it's a really long list with 1 million items in it, it may be tricky to know exactly what was matched because authenticate only returns true or false. So maybe what we want to have is a convenience method to do a lookup from that original list. Does this authenticate? Yes. Okay. Well, fetch me the user where name is something. Does that make sense? We still have the original and we have the credentials, so maybe that's something that the user land can develop. What are your thoughts on that? Do we want to add that to our design? Remember, every single thing we add to our design we have to maintain. Every single public or protected method, unless we document it elsewhere, according to semver, which is a versioning standard that is widely used these days. Every single protected or public method, unless otherwise documented, when it is changed in its signature, becomes a breaking change. So that means bumping a new version and having change logs there and having upgrade guides there. As far as possible, unless we document otherwise, we want to reduce the number of protected and public methods. The smaller our interfaces, the smaller our concretions can be, the simpler our code is to maintain and the easier it is to use. That's a very good blanket statement because it's totally true. Okay, just before I carry on, semver.org I think it is, in case you haven't heard of this. So this is a standard that is widely followed by the development community. And it basically says versions are made up of 3 parts. There's a major version, there's a minor version, and there's a patch version. Big breaking changes to your code, new versions that are rewrites, things that change method signatures, those are a major version. Things that add functionality in a non-backwards compatibility breaking way, those are minor. And bug fixes, which only fix bugs. Only fix bugs. They don't add new features, they don't make breaking changes, they only fix bugs. they're a patch version. So you have a piece of code or a library that is version 1.0.0. You've just released it, that is its first version. You find a bug, you fix just that bug, then you release version 1.0.1 because it's just a patch, it just fixed a bug. You add some new functions, well, then it becomes 1.1.0. You make a breaking change, you do a complete rewrite, it's 2.0.0. Semver is a really good standard for this. It allows things like Composer and NPM to work predictably because you can lock to a major version. You can say, give me the code for this library with all the bug fixes and all the extra functionality, but lock it to version 2 or version 3. And if the library authors that maintain this library that you're using, if they follow Semver correctly, you should never have to worry that code they add in a version that is locked to 2 or locked to 3 is going to have a breaking change. It just won't. Because NPM and Composer will update the minor version, they'll update the patch version, and those will keep working because there are no breaking changes, but they won't update the major version if you lock it to a version. So using Semver and libraries with authors that implement Semver and things, dependency managers like Composer and NPM, you can be quite happy about the code that you depend on. You can upgrade it to fix security issues, to fix bugs, to add minor functionality, and not to have breaking changes. You can just NPM update or Composer update and it'll work. It's really cool. The flip side of that is that if you implement a library, you probably want to implement Semver because it is really good. It's a lot more work because you have to consider all the changes you make, but people who use your code will be really happy. Okay, test authenticate, test inputs validated. What else should we do? What should we do now? I will ask chat. What do we do now? Do we try and implement a different... Do we try and make a different implementation that doesn't use arrays? Maybe it uses a database. Maybe it uses HT password. Do we implement one of those? Or do we try and extend this functionality? Or do we try and document this functionality? What do you want to do, chat? New concretions, extend functionality, document. What do you want to do? I'll wait for 1 minute. What next? Extend functionality. Okay, so make it through DB and make it through JSON. Those seem to be the two options so far. I assume make it through implement with JSON means given a path to a JSON file, do the users in that file authenticate? Is that what you're asking? Gamer Coder? Implement this with a JSON API. Okay. So, do we want to add to the functionality of this a way to have your website to create an instance of a class and to... Hi, Greg. Gregulate. Gamer Coder, just so I clarify, do we want to have a class in this library that acts as like a JSON server? Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Yeah, it's not Java though. I mean, PHP is very much like Java. Anyway, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to take a 2-minute break quickly because I want to get some more water. So I'll do that. But when we come back, we are going to be looking at I'm kind of torn. I don't know whether we're going to be doing a database version of the Authenticator or whether we're going to be doing a file that acts as a JSON server. I don't know yet. But I'll be back in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, see you now.